Like, so now you have like the US or Western world kind of, busy into another kind of thing. So, Taiwan and other things is even easier, kind of,
Yeah,
if that
well,
makes sense.
I think the Taiwan question is a whole separate bundle of considerations on the point of view of the Chinese. But it's definitely, I mean, the more that China would definitely be happy with the West being tied down more. The biggest thing that China wants now is a clear break between Europe and the United States on
Hmm.
something, whether that's Ukraine or the Middle East. And if they think they can get it over the Middle East, they would absolutely take it and do it. It's not clear that they're going to expend the diplomatic capital on that, when in the end, what they really want right now is to place themselves in the driver's seat in Ukraine to pry apart everyone. But that's not to say, I mean, on the Russian side, the centerpiece of Russian strategy right now is trying to foment divisions and ideally create another problem for the United States and the Europeans, so that there's just something else for them to deal with. There's, for example, there's a much more direct line between what's happening in Sudan and Russia than one would think. The Russians have been pipelining weapons into Sudan for a long time, and Wagner is definitely involved. Not to say they're in the driver's seat, but these like spiraling crises that could sap Western
Hmm.
attention, absolutely they'd want that. It would also induce a lot more instability in the Eastern Mediterranean, which would disrupt Ukrainian grain shipments out from the Black Sea,
Right.
thereby placing even more stress on Europe. As I'm sure you've seen over the past few weeks, the Poles, Romanians
Yeah,
decided
yeah.
that
With the
Ukraine was dumping in their markets, etc. So that revives that issue once again. So there are all these incentives for Russia to let this go as far as it possibly can. The United States is the hardest one here because historically speaking, the United States has been willing to give Israel cover for wars. Each time Israel executes a military operation, Israel receives a grace period of between 5 days and like 8 weeks to get it done. And this has been true since 67, arguably. The issue here is the operation, and at minimum, I would suspect the United States would give Israel that grace period in effect
Mhm.
to finish out, to try to move in Lebanon. The problem that the Israelis have now is it's not clear if the United States would actually give them the grace period they need, which would take 2 to 5 months to really wrap this war up in the way that would solve the Israeli strategic problem. Because the second this starts, this is going to be zipped around on every propaganda network and every social media network in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Latin America, and used as a weapon again by Iran, by Russia, and by China to undermine American credibility
Yes, of
and to
course.
undermine and to demonstrate the United States is actually a colonial actor that is supporting, and all the anti-Semitic tropes you can think of as well, supporting this, that, and the other thing in the Middle East. So the Israelis are very live to the fact that they'll get pressured by the Americans to wrap this up before they're actually done with it. So it creates this uniquely unstable situation once it starts, where everyone's actually also incentivized to move really hard and decisively, because the longer this war goes on, the more these escalatory these escalatory options spiral outwards.
Harry, before we move, you know, to Europe and how all like Europe comes into play here
Yeah.
and all of the effects and so on and so forth, let me just or let us understand like what you are watching. Like we talked a little bit about like lead indicators and signals, events, any of that. Like what are you looking at for the for the 18-24 month period that would either confirm, so in pretty much increase the odds of it happening, or disconfirm your hypothesis?
So the three biggest lead indicators are in very softly ranked order from one to three. The um, the, the active transfer of more sophisticated military technology between Russia and Iran. as one. The a major increase in the sort of low-level violence that we saw swell up over the past 6 to 8 weeks that also includes some kind of rocket and missile activity as two, and as three, Israeli either mobilization or major rehearsals for strike operations.
And how do we track that best? Like, because it's like, it's all kind of like, okay, so I understand the trouble thing with maybe like the rockets or
you can see that, yeah,
attacks.
you can see that stuff online.
You can see this in the news, but like, okay, so the active transfers, we probably can like, look at
active
this as
transfers
well.
You will see, because Iranian weapons, either or both, more likely, Iranian weapons will start showing up in Russia.
Right.
Or, and here's the big, the real big one here, Iran either openly or denies it conducts a nuclear test.
Okay.
Both of those will be latently visible about 2 weeks after they get moving. And I mean, you'll see the Iranian missiles blowing up in Ukraine. They'll be reported. They'll have Iranian serial numbers on them. And on the other side, it'll also there'll be Russian military technology advanced up that to show up in Iran. It'll just be a couple of weeks until it's noticed by open source analysts online, effectively.
And the mobilization part, like, is this like kind of announced? Is this like, transparent? Is this?
Yeah, you'll be able to see. It'll be reported on quietly, but it'll be reported on Israeli news media. Part of the whole issue with this constitutional crisis in Israel is people refusing to show up for mobilization and training. Part of the reason that the current government has decided to step back for now is there's I suspect an awareness on their part that a war was actually quite likely over the past 6 weeks and remains very likely, and that the most important thing right now is maintaining the structure of the Israeli military mobilization system, and that this political issue has disrupted it so deeply as to actually decrease deterrence credibility. So you'll see that the advantage of these three things is you can see them all happening live, and they will all show up in normal news media.
So you're kind of saying like Netanyahu is actually a peacemaker because of this was distraction not to mobilize, kind of, right?
Yeah, well, I think that was I mean, I don't know if he's a peacemaker, but the really complicated thing here is who's actually driving what aspect of this reform. This reform is getting at a really bad structural problem in Israeli society that's existed and become worse and worse since labor lost its stranglehold on power back in the 70s and 80s, and is only intensified until now. And all of it's wrapped up in these questions about Israeli identity and Jewish identity and the future of the state. And the fundamental problem is the Israeli society is not structured to have these conversations. It's similar to culture war hot button issues in the US, but it's worse in some ways because the political system in the US, at least, is federalized. So there are different levers of debate at different levels of the system. In Israel, that's not the case. It's an all or nothing kind of proposition. So Netanyahu is walking a tightrope now between dealing with his coalition and having this thing blow up in his face. And we'll see. We'll see how long the threat of war keeps the coalition from pushing ahead again.
So let's move on. Before we wrap up, let's move on to Europe, because that's kind of like where a lot of implications of everything that we just discussed will be felt. So how will it look like? What do you think is likely going to happen?
So on the European side of things, the three top line issues here are, one, the effect of this on the war in Ukraine, and whether or not this actually does split American and European attention, demand other military assets to be distributed or not. Two, if it actually has a major impact on trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, which would be immensely problematic for Europe as a whole, including those former and non-members of the EU, just because of the way that because of European reliance on trade from Asia. And three, the potential for accelerating spillover effects that trigger more refugee crises. and that would shock the European domestic political model enough to really trigger social problems. The first issue, that of Ukraine, it depends on how widely the conflict spirals. And obviously, there's definitely an incentive for Iran to expand this conflict further, but there's also on the other side a desire to very much. It's not clear that that jihadist organizations don't like Europe, but it's not clear how much your average citizen of one of the Gulf Arab states or Iraq or Syria really dislikes France or Germany or the UK or the EU. It's just not apparent. So there are some incentives to keep it somewhat contained, but once missiles start flying, it only takes a miscalculation or two, or American, say, intelligence involvement and help with Israeli targeting to push this over the line. I mean, as we saw with, as we now know, given the information that came out of the Pentagon a couple weeks ago in Ukraine, there have been situations where you've had very close calls between Western aircraft and Russian aircraft. A similar phenomenon is easily possible if this actually goes off. If it splits attention, then cohesion starts to get sapped for Ukraine. Then the Ukrainians themselves probably start to suspect that the West is less likely to remain engaged in the fight. And the more problematic and the more space that Russia has to start to insert itself informationally, that China does as well, the more likely the conflict in Ukraine gets wrapped up in a way that's advantageous to Russia and disadvantageous to Europe and Kiev. So that's top line implication number one. Why is it top line? Because in the end, the most fundamental issue for European security, period, right now, will be Ukraine until the war has been ended. Two, if you start to see shipping costs skyrocket in the Eastern Mediterranean because you have insurance problems, much like you did in the Black Sea, that's going to cost a lot of people a lot of money. That's going to very thoroughly disrupt global supply chains because you'll have to reroute stuff all the way around South Africa into Europe. And that's also going to, again, push a lot of these goods from Ukraine, especially food exports, straight into the EU rather than mediating them through maritime transport.
Have you seen recently like prices moving? Because that would be obviously another kind of interesting indicator. If people are already buying insurance.
Yeah, not so much. I mean, when it comes to the reality is, the thing I do find is markets do not like to price in war risk. They really don't like to. And shipping insurance costs might be something that's worth keeping an eye on out of anything, just because Lloyd's has been so engaged in the grain agreement and in monitoring the whole situation that conceivably they would be plugged in enough to have them be a nice bellwether indicator. At the same time, if Ukraine is any example, they didn't adjust for weeks. And they didn't get a handle on the situation for a while. So I wouldn't be as confident, except perhaps as something is about to go off, maybe that's when you'd see it. But I wouldn't count on that for a multiple week, let alone multiple month leading indicator.
Right.
Once it starts, that's going to be a big problem. And it looks like Europe's broken some of its inflationary problems. You add in another supply chain disruption, and that's going to derail the situation. And then finally, a potential refugee crisis that spirals out of this, the scale and size of this war would mean it could intersect with Turkey and also spill over and have ripple effects in North Africa. There's why is North Africa relevant? Turkey and Russia brush up in two areas, Syria and Libya. Those have both been, insofar as one can reasonably describe it, at peace, not violent, for about 18 months, because they both parties reached a tenuous consensus and the war in Ukraine starts. And no one has an incentive to disrupt the balance. If this starts to spiral outward, then all of the sudden, Ankara, which has its own interests vis-a-vis Iran and Russia, but fundamentally does not see Iran, the growth of Iranian power, as something that benefits its interests in the region, and also does not see Russia's presence in the Eastern Mediterranean as beneficial, could capitalize. It could feel the need to reestablish deterrence with Russia. Similarly, Russia could use this as more space and opportunity to try to overstretch the West and start another series of crises in North Africa. So and of course, the third implication becomes a lot more likely the longer the conflict goes on, which is, and it means that the first two aspects of it as well, particularly the second question about shipping prices and the flow of goods, will compound the potential for number three, because you'll have the same economic effects in the Middle East and in North Africa as you would in Europe, but it always goes worse when you have major inflationary problems in societies that are just much poorer as a baseline.
When you talk to people, I mean, you are, like you're talking to many policymakers, analysts from around the world. Like, do they have this, issue on their radar? Is there
yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
So like,
no. Absolutely.
Because it does seem to be still like a little bit of an out of consensus view, right? So it's like, so what's the sentiment? I think that's the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an out of consensus view, I think, for two reasons. One, there's so much focus on Ukraine for obvious, like completely obvious reasons. That just when it comes to the news cycle and what the average individual can absorb, even the politically engaged one, or even someone who works in a financial sector that this matters to, that's what they're going to be focusing on rather than this. And two, the Middle East, there are so many different domestic tugs of issues in each of the major actors that it makes these really convoluted causational channels to get all of this spiraling together. Iran, the regime there, we didn't talk much about this, but it's worth noting that it's still under a degree of pressure, not catastrophic, but under pressure. Khamenei is also very old, and he's probably going to die soon, which leads to, I say soon in a very general sense, by the way. That I would not put any money on. We know he's had cancer, but that's about it. But that transition will also induce other problems there. Saudi has everything. It's less crazy than it used to be, but Saudi is always Saudi. And Israel is still wrapped in the depths of this major constitutional crisis that's been on hold, but isn't over by any means. So the reality is, when one looks at the Middle East, the thing that one is drawn to is those questions, rather than the major potential or the significant potential of a war in the Mediterranean littoral. But yeah, policy. I mean, on the policy side, this is not exactly a revolutionary opinion, and there are plenty of. I'm a military analyst more so than anything. That's why my discussions of this is focused on the military calculations at play. But on the political side of it, and on those who I speak to who are very much Middle East analysts in particular, this is a thing amongst intelligence agencies and political establishments there, also just policy watchers that are that there was a suspicion that when I spoke to you last that this was going to happen by now. And it didn't. Everyone was there were people who were surprised by that. There are a variety of reasons for that. Again, these causational channels are very weird because it's not Europe, where you have multi-party democracies that, as insane as they might be, they have constitutional structures that are visible. The Middle East doesn't work like that.
Yeah, it's more nebulous, and I see. Okay, perfect. So that was great. I learned a lot, even though it seems to be an opinion that's like already out there and is discussed. Where can people find you to follow your work, Harry? Apart from Cassandra.
Yeah, well, apart from Cassandra, of course, the first place everyone should find me. So I can be gotten in touch with by Yorktown Institute. My contact page is on the website. Working on building my Twitter presence. My handle is Naval Second Strike, second being spelled with a 2. But yeah, I mean, what you're welcome to. I don't post much, but I follow a number of people who are interesting about a variety of things and far more interesting than I am. So if you enjoyed this, I would surely suggest exploring my followed.
Harry, thank you so much for your time. It was great. I learned a lot.
Thank you as well. Excellent to be on.